Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the Saline City Planning Commission for Wednesday, December 8th, 2021. Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, tonight we have Chairperson Fosdick, Vice Chair Heft, Secretary Treasurer Carroll. Are you online, Dan?
No, he said he's in.
He's out? Okay. Mayor Morrow, Councilmember Gearbaugh, State Staff Rep Police Chief Hart. We have Commission Members Beardsley, Troika, and Young. We also have with us tonight City Planner Lewan. We also have Assistant City Manager, Community Director Green, and Deputy Clerk Ritchie. Also present tonight, and Doug, I'm going to let you have a few minutes. Is your replacement or the new guy?
Well, thank you. As I had mentioned, I don't think everyone was here at the last Planning Commission meeting when I was here, but so you may or may not know, but Chris Atkin from our office left. He left Carlisle Wortman Associates and is now, I believe, the Community Development Director for the City of Jackson. So he moved on to Jackson, and we congratulated him for that. So, of course, we had to fill some spots. And one of those spots we filled was a young man you see standing in front of you. That's Mike Auerbach from now with Carlisle Wortman Associates. He was previously a assistant planner with the City of Dexter, and he was with the City of Dexter for, I believe, 3 years. And he will be assisting the city with this kind of thing, planning commission, site plan reviews, that all that sort of thing. But like we did with Chris, while I wasn't coming to the planning commission meetings, Chris and I would kind of go over all the projects. So I had a pretty good idea what was happening. And I will be I'll be here like I always am for the city. But Mike will be the day-to-day face kind of going forward that you'll see mostly at Planning Commission. There'll be a little bit of a transition while he gets comfortable here. But with that, I just wanted to introduce Mike. I don't know if you have a few words you might want to mention to the Planning Commission and put you on the spot.
Welcome.
Likewise.
Yep. Welcome, Mike. Okay. We'll start with, there is a motion to approve the agenda as distributed.
So moved.
It has been moved Morrow, seconded Heft. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. There is a motion to approve the meeting minutes for November 10th, 2021 as submitted.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved Heft, seconded Young, to approve the minutes. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Okay, citizen comments. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person, and the citizen comment period will have a limit of 45 minutes. Seeing none, let's move on to public hearings. We'll go to 2121. We have an application from Todd Gensheimer of CP Commercial Real Estate for a preliminary site plan for the new 12,000 square foot indoor sports facility building with 8,415 square foot of parking area for 20 new parking spaces located at 1328 Woodland Drive, East Saline, Michigan, 48176. Parcel number 1812-20-430-015. And we're looking for a report from Doug.
Thank you. Take this off so you can hear me better. Yeah, we did a report dated November 24th, 2021, and our report goes over both the preliminary site plan as well as the special land use review, which I know you're going to be handling separately. Our report really talks about both of those together, so I'll give you a summary of some of the high points, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer those. So the project itself is for a 12,000 square foot indoor sports facility on a vacant 3.2 acre parcel on 1328 Woodland Drive. The applicant is proposing a 20 space parking lot in association with the facility. No outdoor facilities are shown on the site plan, and according to the information provided by the applicant, the facility is to be an indoor baseball and softball training facility. On page 2 of our report, we go through the special land use considerations, so I think I'll wait to go over those until the next part of the agenda. With regard to the site plan, again, this is a preliminary site plan, so just so that those that might be watching at home and the planning commissioners, just to remind you, this is a preliminary site plan is a required part of special land use review, so the applicant is required to provide a preliminary site plan. The preliminary site plan is more conceptual in nature. A lot of the final detail of the site plan will not be provided until the next stage of review, and that is if the conditional land use and preliminary site plan is approved by the city. At the next stage of review, the applicant will have to provide a detailed site plan that shows all of the, landscaping, lighting, signage, floor plans, elevations, engineering details, all that sort of thing. But we do make some general comments with regard to the site plan currently. And the first has to do with what we call the bulk requirements, or the area width, height, and setbacks. And as you can see from our comments on page 3, the applicant has met all of those setback requirements. We have no issue with the location of the building, location of parking for this proposal. With regard to natural resources, there are some issues that we've flagged with regard to natural resources that the applicant will have to provide some additional information on. And those have to do with wetlands on site, soils on site, and floodplain on site. The information that is found in our report on page 4 was taken from the Washtenaw County GIS mapping system that indicates a lot of information, but there's a whole section or a whole part of that GIS system that talks about natural features. And if you open up the layers for this site, there is a substantial part of this site is identified as a wetland. A substantial part of this site is identified as having floodplain associated with it, as well as having soils that could be difficult to develop in. So that all being said, and with the idea that this is a preliminary site plan of a kind of conceptual nature, the applicant will really have to address these items in detail at the final site plan stage. But even at the preliminary stage, we'd be interested in knowing how they believe they can overcome these. I will also say that the county GIS mapping system is of a general nature, and if the applicant was to do actual on-site evaluations, it's not uncommon for, say, a wetland boundary that shows up in the county GIS to be in a different location. So we would expect, at least by the time this gets to the final site plan stage, that these natural feature issues be ironed out to a greater degree than they are right now, because all we can tell from the general information we have is that there are some issues on this site with regard to wetlands and floodplains. With regard to the building location and site arrangement, we have no issue with how they're designing the site. Makes sense, aside from the issues I just mentioned. With regard to parking, as I mentioned when I started, the applicant is proposing a 20-space parking lot. This is one of those land uses that does not have a specific parking calculation attached to it. And so when we have these situations where there's no parking calculation, we normally will rely on the applicant to provide us some basis for why they've come up with the number they've come up with. As I mentioned, they came up with a 20-space parking lot. Perhaps the applicant can let us know where that number came from, how they think that will serve their needs. And if they can, if they can do that and provide that kind of information, the Planning Commission has the ability to allow that number to go forward. For facilities like this, we would, in our experience, the only issues that occur for like an indoor commercial recreation type facility is if they have one group that's training. Sometimes they'll do it as a team, because I know my son was in Little League and they did team training at facilities like this, and then another team waiting to get in. And so sometimes if there's an overlap, the parking can get stressed. So I guess some discussion about, when one group is coming, when the other group is leaving, to make sure there's not a big overlap, it would be helpful to determine if the parking that's being proposed is acceptable. We have no issue with site access and circulation. We have some details with regard to sidewalks and safety paths on site that really are final site plan issues, but we raised them here for the benefit of the applicant. And then as far as landscaping, lighting, signage, floor plans and elevations, those are all required final site plan issues, not preliminary site plan issues. We did have a comment on the floor plans and elevations with regard to the uses in the building, and this does, so sometimes we use the floor plan to help us determine what uses or what's actually going to take place within the building, or how much of a certain thing is taking place within a building. And we just want to know if there's any retail use going on within the building, or if they're going to be leasing out any part of the building to someone else. So just some information, and that does get back to the use question, which we'll be talking about next on the agenda. So that would be helpful to have that information. At this point, no variances are being requested, so we don't have any issue with variances for the project. And as we typically do, our recommendation in this case is that these comments should be addressed to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission prior to this project. Address your satisfaction prior to approval. And if there's any questions anybody has, I'd be happy to try to answer those.
When you look at this layout, is this the most optimal layout for this lot at this time? For the issue concerning if this was to be used for a different purpose in the future, would it prohibit expansion or other use of this property? Initially, it is industrial.
Yeah, I believe, and if, I don't know if the applicant's online. Is the applicant online?
He's in the back.
The applicant's here. I believe part of the reason for this layout is due to the floodplain on site, that they're trying to avoid the floodplain as much as possible, but maybe the applicant can address that. There does, if there was going to be some changes here, they would likely have to move a few things like the parking. But the building, in theory, could be moved as long as they would have to revise the parking on site. But I believe this is the location due to the floodplain issue that I had raised.
Yeah, that's correct. And if you saw in the applicant's letter, they also included the FEMA map. That kind of gives you guys a visual of where this floodplain is, and that is correct. The whole point of putting the building and parking where it is to avoid as much of that floodplain as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Bill?
If, and I was on the same line of thought that Commissioner Gearbach was on, in that maybe there's a future use that isn't a sports academy. Not that this developer needs to worry about that, but might want to. But along that line, if this were a manufacturing facility of 12,000 square feet, what kind of parking requirement would there be for that?
Yeah, I figured this question was going to come up, so I had off-street parking pulled up. So for our industrial use standards for off-street parking, industrial or manufacturing establishments is 1 per each employee or 1 per each 800 square foot of floor area, whichever is greater. So
So
it
it'd
could
be
be,
okay.
based on floor area, it could be 15.
Yeah.
or if for some reason there's hundreds of employees in there, then they're gonna have an issue. The other thing with industrial, if it's a warehouse, they're required 1 per 2,000 square foot, so they could only need 6. So as of right now, building size, the parking does exceed what our standards are. And based on their report, they believe it's 25% more than they're ever gonna need.
Got it, thank you.
Okay, Mike, do you want to finish up?
Yeah, just mine's real quick. Doug hit the high points, and as I mentioned, the applicant did address some of the questions that we did have. A lot of it, like Doug mentioned, will be details that are laid out in the final report, such as specifics about the soil, as they have completed soil borings, they just don't have the data yet back, along with why you don't see an OHM report in here, as most of the details aren't provided yet, so we don't send this off to OHM for more review. But yeah, due to the fact that it is a preliminary plan, it's very conceptual in nature. I believe this meets our standards for approval. Additionally, along with the comments from Doug, Fire Chief Spurl did reply and had feedback right now. His are very preliminary as well, as they could be incorporated to the final site plan. So his are just making sure the driving template's included so he can confirm fire truck, make sure there is a fire hydrant on site so it can reach every part of the building, and make sure there is a emergency access drive on certain parts of the building, just in case. So, yeah, all that information will come, especially once we have the turning template.
One more question.
Bill?
Doesn't it seem a little backwards that we're dealing with the site plan before we're dealing with the special use? Or is it really because special use consideration really wants to have that vision of usage, so you chicken and an egg kind of thing?
It pretty much is a chicken and egg thing. It's just the way our ordinance is laid out, that site plans have to be approved before special land uses are considered,
Got it.
and then we go from there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, there is a motion to acknowledge receipt of the report dated November 24th from City Planner Luan and memo dated December 2nd from Mr. Green.
I'll move to acknowledge receipt, Mr. Chair.
It's been moved, Mayor Morrow, seconded Heft, to acknowledge the receipt of the report. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Ayes have it. This is basically the time we give the developer to kind of come on up. If any of you have questions for Mr. Gensheimer? If you want to make a few comments, Todd, have at it.
Good evening. I didn't prepare any remarks. I will just say generally I agree with what's already been stated. I think we've submitted a letter to address all of the points raised by the Signage review. It is largely intended to be addressed in the final site plan. Most of those things can easily be resolved or will be resolved certainly before we move forward with final site plan approval, but there isn't anything here that I think stands in the way the project moving forward. As we presented to the city council when we first made our offer on the land, the intended use is actually to adapt to a warehouse, not manufacturing, in the event something were to happen and not to serve the intended purpose today. But the intended purpose today is to provide a building for Michigan Sports Academy. Michigan Sports Academy's been operating in Saline for 13 years, 20 years in existence. It's a very successful business. We understand the business very well. And we think that they will do this fine in this location. We've addressed the parking. We've addressed the wetlands issue. I can add to that if anybody has questions about it. I brought a color picture to make it a little more helpful if you want one. I didn't have it at the time that we submitted our remarks, but we did design the building location, parking lot based on the 500-year floodplain, and that's an important point. It's a 500-year floodplain. All of Flat Out Red is in the floodplain. I mean, the whole side of that industrial park is in the floodplain. But it's a 500-year floodplain. It isn't the 100-year floodplain. There are complications with the site, and we've attempted to address those with our building location. And my picture, if you want to see it, shows that we have nestled it into the exact corner to maximize the avoidance of that 500-year floodplain. But anything can be expanded on. It just costs money, and we're trying to avoid that. We could, in future, add a second building. You'd have to raise the site. You'd have to do remediation. There's other things that you would probably have to do. But for this intended purpose, we believe we're well suited to standards for the city's plan. But I'll answer any questions that you have.
Just one question. When you talk about the parking, what is the Academy's current average use? Do you know what that is in terms of parking?
I do, so they have 8 stations currently, and I put this in my written answers. They have 8 stations, 5 batting cages, and 3 throwing stations. Each station can only be manned by 1 athlete at a time and 1 instructor at a time. So the maximum they would ever envision being in the facility was 16 people. But they rarely have over 10 in their 13-year history that they would ever have. We don't do full teams to address the CW review. We don't have the MSA people, I should say. I'm not part of them. They don't do full team practices. They're only individual instruction, largely 14 to 18-year-olds, not the small youngsters that do a lot of full team practices. And so we don't anticipate any problem with parking. However, I would just mention this, if the fire chief does want to turn around, add it, we don't think we have to, we'll sit down with him, we don't think we need to do any additional driveways to meet his 150-foot standard. We just think we need to review our intentions with him and he'll be satisfied. But we will have to add a turnaround, we'll probably do it with gravel if we can, at the end of the parking lot, that would provide some overflow if we need to. But I don't think we'll ever need it.
Bill?
It looks like you addressed all of the issues pretty well. The one that I think remains outstanding, perhaps, is the recommendation to move the sidewalk. And I'd hate for that not to be at least discussed so that you wouldn't have to go through multiple versions of a final site plan if in fact it's a big deal to the commission and we end up not talking about it today. So can you maybe elaborate on why you think moving that is not something you want to do?
The layout of our interior of the building is to have the offices along that wall, and therefore the limited air conditioner and furnace spacing would be along that wall. We'd like not to put the sidewalk against the building because that's where we intend to shield and put the condenser for the air conditioning unit. We also just feel it's more economical, more practical to have the sidewalk adjacent to the parking lot. I understand the reviews comments, we just don't fully agree, and that we think if we sit down in the room, we can convince them that we'll be okay with our intention, even if we have to widen the sidewalk slightly. But ultimately, we think we're okay the way we designed it. Our architect has been very thoughtful in his intent.
Thank you. Any more questions for Todd? Okay, thanks, Todd. We have a motion to open the public hearing.
So moved.
It's been
Second,
moved-
Gearba.
It's been moved Gearboss, seconded Heft, to open the public hearing. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? There is a motion to close the public hearing.
I'll move to close.
Second.
It's been moved Brian and seconded Young to close the public hearing. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Ayes have it. Comments, questions from planning commission members? What do you think?
I guess I do have one. We'll go to Mr. Gearba first. Get his hand up.
Just a process question. Any concerns with the aesthetics or the look of the building and all those will be met in final site plan approval, correct? So it meets the covenants or whatever we may have.
Yeah, luckily for this part of the industrial park, there's no incredibly strict standards. It really refers just to the ordinance, and since we do have a new industrial appearance standards, they will meet those in the final site plan.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
Gentlemen, I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question, so bear with me. It's relating to the issue of floodplain as it relates to this development, but the comment or question I'm going to ask could be more broadly applied. One of my council colleagues and I just attended the quarterly SEMCOG conference in Detroit, and a bulk of the conversations and presentations were devoted to infrastructure, specifically stormwater management. And based on a panel of 5 or 6 experts that they had present, it is their conclusion that 100-year rainstorms, as previously defined, are really about every 10 years now. And that's the trajectory we're on for the foreseeable future. So I guess this is perhaps more of a question for Doug, but maybe also for Mike. Both of you are welcome to respond. Noting sort of the change in weather patterns and the excessive rains that we seem to experience, which are only going to continue. Is that in any way going to change the models, the recommendations, the manner in which these proposals are evaluated? Again, it was a really clumsy way to ask that, but I've been meaning to bring this up ever since Councilmember CEO and I attended the SEMCOG conference back in September.
I'll take the first stab at it. I really think it's going to take until FEMA updates floodplain standards, because until then, we're just going based off perception. As we know, it does rain more. We know flooding occurs more, but until it becomes an official record, it's hard for us to enforce something like that. So right now, OHM is going to use the same Washtenaw County standards they always do during their review. So until those are updated.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we have to deal with what we have to deal with right now. And then the other good thing is, as the applicant mentioned, they're out of the 500-year zone, so they're not proposing building within that area. So they're already taking that one little extra step of getting it out of the 500-year. But yeah, no, I would agree. Until the ordinance change or until the law changes, it'd be really difficult for communities to try to impose a different standard without a lot of study.
Yeah, my questions weren't necessarily directed to this development more broadly, but the takeaway from the conference is that municipalities ought not skimp or become lax on anything related to stormwater management. And evidently, this is an interesting statistic. All of the issues that were experienced this past season in southeast Michigan, where there was excessive flooding or feet of water in people's basements, it's all in jurisdictions where the stormwater management practices predate the current regulations. Any development, any project that has implemented contemporary stormwater standards did not experience the type of issues that some municipalities did this past spring and summer. So I'll get off my high horse. I'm sorry to get us into the weeds there.
More questions? There is a motion. What is your pleasure?
Move to approve with conditions.
Second.
It has been moved by Dean Gearbaugh and seconded Cheryl Heff to approve as written with current 1 and 2 statements attached. Discussion. All those in favor, state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Thank you. All right, let's go on to new business, which is an application from Todd Gensheimer for CP Commercial Real Estate for the special land use for section 4.0415 for an indoor sports facility in the I-2 district located at 1328 Woodland Drive East, Saline, Michigan, 48176, parcel number 181220430015. You're on again, Doug.
Okay, thank you. I'll start by saying I agree with Commissioner Beardsley that this is an odd way to do this. And we may want to look at the ordinance to change that, because this is not necessarily a typical way that communities look at special land uses. So these should be more together instead of separate. But it is what it is, and that's fine. We'll just kind of move on. But it is sort of odd. So with regard to the special land use, so we've got, again, for those watching at home and the Planning Commission, the second part of this is the discretionary part. So the first part, site plan review, as long as they meet the minimum standards, we kind of have to approve it. That's what site plan review is. Special land use review is one of the times that a city can have a discretionary element to your approval. You don't have to approve a special land use, where if a site plan meets all the minimum standards, you have to approve a site plan. So, so in every zoning district, there's, as you probably know, there's a list of uses permitted by right, and there's a use of special land uses. The uses permitted by right, kind of like a site plan, if they meet the minimum standards, you have to approve it. The other list of uses, in this case, the indoor recreation that's allowed within the industrial district, is one of those uses that the Planning Commission and ultimately the City Council will have to make a decision on this, has the ability to look at how this use interacts with the neighbors and how it interacts with the city. And then you apply the standards that I'll go over in my report that start on page 2 of this report. And we're trying to make a determination that this use will be compatible with this part of the city. A special land use, all special land uses aren't compatible to every location that they are located. That's why we have this public hearing, that's why we have this discretionary review. So, in this particular case, the applicant did provide a written narrative that addressed each of the 7 criteria that are shown on page 2 and 3 of our report. And we agree with the applicant, for the most part, that this use will be compatible with the, with the area where it's located. There's already other facilities like this nearby, so we don't, we don't think that this is going to cause a lot of problems to the community. However, we would like a little more information, and perhaps the applicant can mention this evening, a little more detail on the description of the facility as it relates to use, hours of operation. We already heard a little bit about the number of people utilizing the facility. And that's the kind of detail that helps us determine if the use will be compatible with where it's being proposed. So that kind of thing. How many people, what's the expected traffic? I mentioned in here, is there any outdoor, there's a lot of yard, a lot of rear yard and side yard in this particular facility. And although it's in a floodplain, we assume that most of the year that yard will be dry and fine to walk on. And so we would, just want to kind of get it on the record that, to know, I should say, what the applicant's intention is, if any, for that outdoor space. Are they going to be doing any training outdoors? Is there going to be, part of any of the facility to be used outdoors? And if so, we should know that, because that could be, potentially an issue with neighboring properties. So that's the only thing. Otherwise, we're in agreement with the applicant's narrative that they provided. There are 7 criteria. I won't read them all, but they all really have to do with how the site will impact the neighbors. And all the other things that I went through were really for the site plan itself. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything here. Yeah, no, that's it. So I think really the only thing I'm really looking for here from the applicant is a little better description of the use, hours of operation, that sort of thing. And if they did address that, I apologize, I did not see their response to that. So with that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions that the Planning Commission might have.
Dean?
Of course I have. In the past, we've also allowed these special land uses, and we've not been clearly identifying exactly what an indoor sports facility is. And so it seemed to be very broad, and that in this type of situation, I can understand now the way it's being used, it could be maybe just for 15, 16, 20 people, whatever. But if that building was to be repurposed for some type of other exercise or whatever, then all of a sudden it isn't the same type of use. And where we ran into problems before was that it didn't necessarily, it didn't make this inapplicable for the new use. So what do we need to do in this term to make sure that it stays for this purpose? Because I think it's a condition or something to clarify that if it does change, then we do have to readdress and then deal with the parking and those things at that time.
Well, what you can do for a conditional use, this is one of the times that the Planning Commission can actually place conditions on something. Usually for just a straight site plan, you can't place conditions on a site plan. But a conditional land use, you can place conditions. So if you're concerned about the numbers of participants, the Planning Commission could add a condition, say for example, that no more than 20 participants, whatever the number is. He said 16, but maybe you'd go a little higher than that just to make sure there's no problem. So, no more than 20 participants at any one time. That's the kind of thing you as a Planning Commission have the ability to place those conditions.
So something like no off-site parking associated with this operation?
Yeah, if you wanted to make sure they weren't doing some kind of, tournament or something, not that they would, but something like that. Yes, you could do that.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
Comment, not a question, Mr. Chair, if that's okay. Again, to piggyback on Commissioner Beardsley's point, this is the protocols that we use for a site plan and then subsequently a special land use, it is a bit, I think, antiquated and clumsy. The good news is, I think we have a protocol in place to address this. And so between Mr. Beardsley and Mr. Green, I'd ask that this be discussed at a code review, it's not a task force anymore, code review committee meeting, to see if there's some revisions that would be appropriate and timely for this particular ordinance.
Yeah, and going forward as well, if there is nothing in the ordinance that changes this, you guys always have the right to change your agenda. So another reason we do this is because naturally, based on your guys' bylaws, public hearings have to go first. Public hearings attached to the site plan, not the special land use. So we can always do it at the dais as well.
Yeah, sure. I get that. I'm not hell-bent that the ordinance be changed, but I think it ought to be looked at, because I think we've experienced this once or twice before. So just having a thoughtful discussion on it would be of benefit. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bill?
So I do have one concern in general. And it's not something and it is something I've mentioned before, and that is the loss of industrial space to non-industrial uses. And the first standard that needs to be met talks about, being harmonious with the neighborhood and harmonious with the general and specific purposes of the master plan and if I do recall properly, the master plan actually encourages the city to prioritize the use of industrial property for industrial uses. And I think the reason for that is the roads, the sewer, the water, the gas, the utilities costs a lot of money in an industrial park, and it takes a really significant tax base to pay the city back for that investment. And you won't get it out of a service business because there won't be enough equipment and personal property to generate enough tax. So I am, recalling the other sports facilities that we have approved, and I think I've thought each time how great it is that Saline is becoming, a healthy city and offering these kinds of things. And yet there will be a tipping point, of course, at some point in the future if we have our industrial park land gone and it is being occupied by businesses that don't generate a significant amount of tax revenue for the city. So I'm not at that point to be concerned about it relative to this application, but I think it's something for us to pay attention to and maybe do a study on the users and facilities in the industrial parks and what the sort of tax profile is of those tenants and those operating companies and just try to find some spot where we can be a little bit more prepared in the future and a little bit more intentional about the uses relative to tax revenue in the future. I know that was a lot.
Any more questions? Mike, you want to finish up your report?
Yeah, just real quick, touch on a couple points that Doug mentioned. In their letter, they do provide information of potential hours of operation. None of that should be a major conflict with the area. They're not operating late at night. They're not operating bright and early in the morning. So they should fit right in within normal business hours outside of certain times where they have one-on-one clinics with individuals. Other than that, just my memo just provided a little history that, as we all know, this is a current occupant in the industrial park, and they did receive original special land use approval for their 745 Woodland location back in 2009.
Any questions for Mike? There is a motion to acknowledge the receipt of the report dated November 24th, 2021 from City Planner Lawan, and a memo dated December 2nd, 2021 from Mr. Green.
So moved to acknowledge receipt.
It's been moved, Mayor Morrow, seconded, have to acknowledge the receipt. All those in favor, state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Todd, here's a spot for you if you want to add a few more things.
I have nothing to add, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Gensheim? Looks good. Thanks, Todd.
Okay.
There is a motion to approve, not approve, or approve with conditions. What is your pleasure?
I'll move to approve with conditions, with the second condition being that the use defining indoor sports facility be tied to the Michigan Academy's primary function as described in the letter. Does that work?
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, you could say and as described, do you mean in described in their letter? In their letter, right?
I guess, yeah, their letter.
Yeah, yes.
It would be this one that was his response to the date on the letter, but it says JP Commercial.
And it- Seconded Hart. It has been moved, Dean with conditions, seconded with Hart. Any more discussion?
Mr. Beardsley's point is very clear, and one of the things that we've discussed. It's unfortunate, though, kind of unfortunate, but not so much, that the industrial tax base, as you know, changed significantly when they removed personal property tax, which that was a primary generator for, having manufacturing in our community. This lot, though, as it is, unfortunately, has been a difficult lot to sell and almost impossible to kind of develop. We had a lot of interest in it, but because of all the additional work that needed to be done on it. The other thing is this is actually preserving the business within the city by moving the operations from across the street, basically, to this facility. I think what we really need to do is plan on, if we move towards annexation and the urban development areas to the southwest of the city, we need to make plans for identifying some of that space to become industrial or for more high-end, high manufacturing or other purpose use. But of course, in this situation, we never know what could happen with Forcio or those other plants that could be redeveloped too. So in this case, I'm supporting this use because we are getting tax revenue from this property now. It won't be off the tax board, it'll be off the city's hands, and now it will generate some tax revenue for us and preserve some positions and jobs. Thank you.
Any more discussion? All those in favor, state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Thank you, Todd. All right, let's move on to discussion items. We have the City of Saline Board Commission request for the city support policy. I believe you all have it in your packets, so you need signatures from us, right, Mike?
Yes, please.
You want to explain what we're signing here? I think we all.
Yeah, we talked about this a little last month. Council passed these board and commission policies just so every board can kind of have the same general rules. Naturally, you guys are a commission that has thorough bylaws that cover most of this, but city council is just requesting you guys all sign them so we can have it on record.
Okay,
They return them to Katrina or Deputy Clerk Ritchie.
Yep. Yeah, if you have them today, great. If not, just get it to us when you can.
okay, sign regulation ordinances. Mike, you're up.
Yep, and we also have Attorney Tom Forshee online, as I mentioned last month. So last month, I gave you guys just kind of 1,000-foot view of this ordinance based on code review. We're looking to update this ordinance, mainly because of recent case law that's requesting us to change. And then naturally, whenever we review a sign ordinance, we take a kind of deep dive into it and see what else could change. So you guys have had it for a month. Tom and I are both here to answer any questions you may have or any additional potential changes you might have. And then we can go from there.
Dean?
Just a general question initially. With these changes, what have we now allowed to be more permissible than we have in the past?
The big thing that came along with this ordinance is kind of getting rid of specific definitions of signs. As for code enforcement rules, the new general rule of thumb is we shouldn't have to be able to read the sign in order to enforce our sign ordinance. So that's the big purpose of this update.
I would add also the yard signs, because you really can't call you can't call the signs by what the content of the sign is. So if you would call it a political sign, you can't really do that with the ordinance very safely. And so some of the yard sign rules, which have been expanded. And that was a really difficult thing for the committee to get their arms around and try to figure out how to keep some limits on yard signs without endangering freedom of speech. So that's another area in this ordinance. It's a very tedious process, this ordinance is, and very difficult to sort of reconcile everything from a legal and practical standpoint.
Did we address anything in terms of the time limits and so forth of what they can be allowed and how that addresses? Has that changed? Because you know my concern has been with temporary signs. And that's another issue that I want to see addressed, but it may not be part of this. What it should be is considered at this time.
Definitely was addressed. This print's too small for me to read, so I couldn't tell you what it is, but it was definitely addressed.
Yeah, my only concern has been, we've done a couple revisions of our sign ordinances in the last, I don't know, last 5 to 10 years, and they seem to continue to allow more loopholes than necessarily resolving what the real true issues, I think, are freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And we, as planning, have approved signs and monument signs and things like that for different individuals to use on their properties and commercial properties. But then they were always trying to find a different way to add more signs, more information, more things, and then try to use some loophole. I'm just hoping that there isn't that type of situation occurring in this current sign regulation change. If Tom could verify that?
Yeah, so what we're really trying to do here, and I apologize if I'm repeating what Mike said, but what we have to do is make sure that, and I think some of that drift that you've seen over time has come about because of the case law, because it used to be thought that you could kind of name the purpose of a sign and regulate it differently. Can everybody hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And that you could regulate it differently than others. And so there was a 2015 Reed case, and then there's been cases subsequent to that where, in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court took a really hard look at municipal regulation of signs, and it made it so that basically every sign ordinance in the nation had to be revised and updated. Because, as Mike said, you couldn't call something, a political sign. You couldn't call it a real estate sign. You couldn't call it a sign to point to a certain event or something like that. Because in order to categorize it as such, you'd have to look at the face of the sign. And so the court said, well, it's content-based. So what's happened in practical terms is we've had to make these sign ordinances essentially more generic, which tends to allow more signage. And it's balanced, the sign ordinance has to be balanced with free speech rights. And I think we started this whole exercise looking sort of at, political signs around election times and things like that, where, there may be a lot more signs than usual, and what impact that would have on the community and what impact that would have on safety of drivers and things like that. And we have to focus more and more on safety and less on aesthetics. So, and the cases have kind of gone that way too. So just because something looks gaudy or we don't like the way it looks or it doesn't quite fit. Some of those things had to give way a little bit so that we ensured that people had adequate ability to express their First Amendment rights. And so we did touch on the temporary signage, and then we also talk about yard signage. And we had a lot of discussion in the Code Review Task Force about what is that number? And it has to be justified with evidence and a purpose. And so you'll see in the beginning of the new ordinance, there's quite a bit more content about why we're regulating signs. And we had a lot of discussion at Code Review Task Force about what that tipping point is. And we came up with, a certain number, allowing a certain number more during and around the time of election season. And then classifying all those as just yard signs. So if someone could put, I like this political candidate, or they could just put have a nice day, or whatever content they want to have in it. We're not going to look at that. So that's really the purpose of the ordinance, was to not necessarily wholesale change the amount of signs you'll see, but to categorize them properly and to make sure that we were regulating them in a way that we thought, if challenged, you'd be upheld as having a solid basis for regulating it as so.
So in some examples, I'm thinking, you said where you pretty much can put a yard sign out. What about if you have a contractor and you have a commercial sign and it's out there for 6 months to 9 months in the front yard advertising their business? Can that fall underneath this freedom of expression, or is there a way to regulate that?
So I think that would fall under temporary signage. I believe has construction type signage. If there's a sign allowed, then we're not going to look at what it says. So whatever it would say, that's what would be allowed. So we're just going by number, placement, time, place, and manner is how the cases talk about it.
Okay, so another example, I have a friend that may have a business and they want a sign on my corner. They can stick it in my front yard because it's freedom of expression.
On your property?
If I agree to it.
Oh, if you agreed to it? Yeah. If you had your number of allowable yard signs and it was the right size. Now there's a size element to it too, so they're not going to be able to come put a giant billboard of their signage. But if you wanted to use one of your sign allotment on your yard to say, I like Jim's whatever, that would be up to you.
So in essence, the change is pretty much making it, as long as it meets the size of a sign, you can put anything on your yard for any business or any purpose that there is.
For the most part, short of obscenity, which is a whole nother class of case law on that, but that's pretty extreme stuff.
And this is consistent with all the other communities? What other communities have made this much of a, I would say, a unrestricted approach?
I wouldn't call it unrestricted. It's just classifying things differently than they were before. So if after the Reed case, I would venture to say 99.9% of municipalities had to revisit their sign ordinances, because almost all of them talked about certain types of signs, viewpoint signs, different types and purposes of signs. I haven't seen one that didn't have to be tweaked or reviewed that I've come across. So it's very, very common. The aim again is not to allow more signs, or it's just to categorize them so that when we go to enforce, we have a solid basis to do so.
And just one last question or statement. We made this change, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we had came down about language and such, and of course this got raised because of the political signs and everything. Are we significantly changing it from that? Why was that not still appropriate? Was it not correct when we did it 5 years ago? Or comprehensive?
I think there's always room for improvement. I believe you didn't have a lot of these, but as that case came out and then subsequent cases have come out as well, that all kind of reiterate that point. It's worth it to keep looking and digging to see or is this content-based or is this not content-based? And there's some that are very sly, that you wouldn't think are content-based at first glance. And then later, you realize that, yeah, you do have to look at this, at the face of the sign to regulate it. So, I think it's just a matter of continuous improvement.
Okay.
Tom, it's Chief Hart. So a question is we're making these changes due to case law. If we don't make these changes and code enforcement goes out and tries to enforce our current language, does that then expose us to liability?
It can, but most likely it's, well, both liability and not being able to enforce what we have. And I'm not saying that what we have right now is totally unenforceable. There are, of course, arguments to be made on one side or the other of whether something's content-based or not. So we're just taking the best knowledge that we have of what the cases say to us and applying that to your code to give the best opportunity for what you want to see is in your sign ordinance to make sure that that's enforceable. So yes, there are plenty of First Amendment cases out there regarding signs. It's a well litigated area. And besides that, we want to make sure that when we have to issue a ticket, we want it to be enforced and we want it to be upheld. So if they can go to court and say, well, Judge, this is a content-based regulation here, it should be thrown out, we're going to be in bad shape there. So yeah, both liability and enforcement.
Thank you.
Any more questions or concerns?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, so staff will just work on setting up a public hearing for the next planning commission, probably the second meeting in January. Take it from there.
Thanks, Mike. Discussion item number 3, recreational marijuana zoning ordinance. Mike?
Yep, so City Council tasked Code Review Committee a few months ago after we passed the medical to start looking at recreational. Over the past few months, that is exactly what Code Review has done. As of December 1st, they have finalized their drafts of the regulatory and zoning ordinances for recreational marijuana. As Planning Commission, naturally, you guys oversee zoning, so you guys get the zoning portion to discuss and hold the public hearing before it gets forwarded on to City Council. So this is just a brief discussion to let you guys know where we're at and answer any questions. In summary, this zoning ordinance just mirrors the medical. Really, the only big change is the change of calling a medical dispensary. It's now a retailer, just based on state law. And then other than that, everything else is the same as everything is established as a special land use.
Bill, do you have any comments as a planning commission liaison to code review?
Sure. Of course, the ordinance itself is far more robust than this zoning portion, but as it relates to planning commission, I think the responsibility is making sure that the zoning piece is addressed. And the committee put a lot of effort into really writing the ordinance. We weren't asked to answer the question, should Saline have cannabis in the community? We never even discussed that. We were asked to assume that the city, if the city were to move forward with it, what should the ordinance look like? And that's really the basis on which we crafted the ordinance. And I know there's some feedback from council on some of the zoning components as well. And I think, having a special land use process involved in the retailers and the safety compliance facilities, well, and really all of them, but particularly the retailers, is really important part of the process. And to ensure these places are where we want them to be, given the individual property location, not just the zoning. A lot of discussion about downtown. Some concern about downtown, a lot of discussion about, is Hennifield a school property or simply a school-owned property? And and how should that be dealt with. But in the end, it mirrors the recreational, or excuse me, the medical, and that seemed to be the safest place to go. I would say probably some people think safest place to start, but safest place to be at this point.
Any more questions of Bill or Mike? Okay, number 4, site plan inspections.
Yeah, I can kick it off. Mayor Marl and Mayor Pro Tem Gearbaugh, we talked about this a little bit last meeting, and we had a conversation afterwards about potentially doing site plan inspections specifically on older properties throughout the town. So after I had a meeting with them and City Manager O'Toole, we started discussing about potential options for this and kind of what we're looking at, and we want to get your guys' feedback to see what you think. What we're kind of looking at is doing specific properties throughout the town, older properties, look at their landscape, look at some safety issues, so parking, potentially look at their storm water, and go from there. Naturally, with a process like this, we would utilize the help of Carlisle Wortman and OHM to do the majority of these inspections, as they're the area, they have the expertise and the manpower to do this. And I sent this email to Mayor Pro Tem Gearbaugh and Mayor Morrow earlier. If you guys would like to move forward with some type of project like this, my recommendation would be, when we do our budget discussion, is to include some monies in there for that, as this could range up to probably $2 to $3 grand per property. And when we're talking about property, we're talking about our large properties, so like the shopping centers, larger developments, and areas like that.
Yeah, if I may, and I have articulated this in the past, excuse me. I think that this body today and historically, along with staff and our consultants, has done an excellent job of being very thoughtful and strategic in the review and subsequent approval of site plans. I think this community has a strong track record of approving quality site plans for developments in both the residential, industrial, and commercial categories. I think one of the deficiencies that exists today and historically is our inability or not so much an inability, but our lack of follow-up to ensure that what was agreed to is in effect taking place. And there are a number of aspects, as you all know, contained within site plans that affect the aesthetics of a community, but more importantly, public health and safety. And so I think that there are existing site plans, particularly on larger projects of a commercial and industrial nature, that ought to be thoroughly reviewed. These site plans are legally binding documents, and so the standards and regulations set forth need to be abided by, or abided to, rather. So this is something that I strongly support. It does require some additional evaluation. I do support Assistant City Manager, Community Development Director Green's suggestion that we potentially enlarge our budget to accommodate this. I also think it would be helpful for City Council if, once we have a formal proposal that this group could dissect, for them to chime in and endorse it prior to having this considered by City Council. But this is a priority for me. I think it ought to be a priority for the city, and it is something I plan on messaging on in my January charter-sanctioned State of the City address. So again, Mr. Gearbaugh has been part of this, as referenced by Mr. Green. He participated in a preliminary meeting between Mr. Green, myself, and City Manager O'Toole. I'm not sure if there's anything that he'd like to add at this time.
I agree. With the mayor's approach and everything, we've talked about this, and I think I've had this concern for a number of years, is that we do these things, we put them in place, and yet there's no review of it after 10 years, 5 years even, where landscaping has died and not been replaced. Retention ponds have not been maintained or kept up. There's some other things in terms of just the fencing or some of those issues. Lighting that may no longer be there that was supposed to have been installed and required as safety issues. And in some cases, we're going to have to look at maybe changing some of our building code or the way we review. One of the concerns has been failed parking lots or potholes and some of those type of things, because when they start to fail, they become issues. And when is the time to fix that? And it's really not part of blight, but it is part of the concern of, when things start to look run down, who authorizes that or who reviews it? We don't have really a thorough way of actually identifying that. And in some cases, a large development, say like an apartment complex, has allowed things to change significantly in the last 2 or 3 decades. And those need to be addressed so that we can preserve the, the safety, as the mayor has said. So hoping to do this forward. We know we don't have significant staff to do this, so we know that expertise can come from Carlisle Wortman. They do this normally for a lot of other things, and for our benefit, it's worth it to do it, and at least to get a sample of what we can expect and what we need to do, just to maintain in the future. So I'm hoping we can get support with this, and then actually it just is a good way to do it to prevent any kind of safety issues or concerns. I think we may have maybe resolved an issue without a concern where we had where the one apartment building roof collapsed, even though that was an issue, but there's kind of those things that potentially just looking on those sites to see what could be a problem or an issue are identified and then addressed with later on.
I think the point is we could catch some deficiencies before they become serious problems. Can I ask you a quick question of Mr. Green, Mr. Chair, and then I know Mr. Beardsley has a comment or question. Obviously, we need to follow up, Mr. Gearbaugh and I need to follow up and have a subsequent meeting with you and City Manager O'Toole. Is it your assertion that we could have a formal proposal from Carlisle Wortman to consider and maybe have the Planning Commission chime in on at our next meeting on January 12th?
Potentially. One thing I think I would look from you guys is kind of how many properties we're looking to do. Because that's going to impact the budget a lot. Because naturally, Carlisle Wortman, and especially since the city's eating this cost instead of throwing it on a developer, especially when we're reviewing a project that's 20-plus years old, it's how many do we want to do a year? Do we want to do 5? Do we want to do 10? And once I go, and then after that, it's based on the size, especially when it relates to OHM, and if we're having them review detention ponds, how thorough do we want to be? So I think the first step for you guys that I would appreciate, it's coming up with how many you want to do and potentially which ones.
Bill?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and, but I also think just in those questions, you really need to identify the process by which you're going to identify which of these projects that you're going to have inspected. And, let's face it, we've got projects that don't need a professional inspection to know that they're not doing what they're supposed to do in this city. And so there's probably a little bit more work that needs to be done before, we can really understand the process and what the enforcement looks like as well. So I would encourage us to really build that out a little more fully, but there's no reason at all not to start working it into a budget and talking about doing this.
And I would say worst case, it's, since we are getting into budget season, we can always just place a placeholder in there, and then we can just always work up to that number.
Chief Hart?
Probably a question more for Tom is, Tom, what is our authority to go back to a property? I love the idea. I think it's great accountability. It's closing the loop.
Yeah.
What authority do we have to have someone on our behalf of the government go to a property to inspect it, especially so many years later? And then what would our remedy be? Would this be some type of a court action if we were to find, that the site plan was not followed? Is it a violation, is it a ticket? What is it?
Yeah, and thanks, Chief. And Mike asked this question of me before all this. So we would have the same inspection rights that we would have any code inspector. So, kind of what can be seen from the right of way. So we'll be somewhat limited, but if there's a landscaping that was supposed to be all along a right of way, for example, and it's all dead, that's something that'll be pretty obvious. And that's really what we're trying to go after, I think, is those places that have maybe fallen in disrepair or otherwise have changed. But those site plans do continue to be, they run with the land. Your zoning runs with the land. And, of course, we want to use common sense with all enforcement actions because, you give them a ticket and it still has to go before a judge, and they're going to, scrutinize these things and to see if they're true violations of the site plan. But it does run with the land, and yes, we could, I've suggested, just like a lot of our enforcement, where we try to reach out and say, to the landowner, you know, there's some deficiencies here, and try to get voluntary compliance. And a lot of times that will happen, just people forget to maintain, and it just gets by the wayside, and we can get some voluntary compliance there. But as far as then, you know, as it progresses, they could be issued a zoning violation ticket for failure to abide by their site plan. And I guess in the most extreme case where they continue to refuse, there could be, you know, a revocation of their site plan approval. But mostly the court action would take care of that. So I think there is continued enforceability. The older it gets, the tougher it is. The records might not be as good, or might not be as clear as we thought they were. And so we'll just have to use, you know, that discretion to find the areas that need to be focused on.
Thank you very much.
Would this include reviewing site plans? One issue that I see all the time is there's like an island that sidewalk doesn't connect. Would you go back and review that as well? Because it seems like we're doing what's already built. But, I mean, for example, the U of M health facility doesn't have a sidewalk on it, but the parcel directly to the south is going to have a sidewalk that goes across it. The next one doesn't, and then there's no way to connect it. Would we review that as well as part of this site plan review?
I would say so. We would look at the site plan and see if there's one required to be there, because that's a lot of the issues with lots like that. It's back when the site was approved, sidewalk wasn't required to be there at that time. And there was no condition that said you have to install one when the city says so. So unfortunately with sites like that, it will just have to be special assessed at some later time, will have to be built. But yeah, it'd be things like that we'll always look at and see if there were specific conditions in that approval that for some reason they haven't met, or are just waiting for city to enact it.
And if I may, we do have currently, city council did empower the city manager, and I know she's working on this, to begin a sidewalk initiative to reach out to those areas where we have major deficiencies to see if we can work with the property owners to install a sidewalk. And the parcel, Ms. Young, that you indicated that's owned by University of Michigan Health System was identified along with a large section on Bennett Street, the frontage along Forcia, and several others. So that is on our radar, and it's something that the city manager is working on. Good point. If I may, Mr. Chairman, real quick, just to kind of wrap this up. What I'd like to do then, based on the comments I've received, unless there's objection from the dais, is organize another meeting between myself, the assistant city manager, and Mr. Gearbaugh. We can maybe work to finalize a draft proposal to bring before the Planning Commission to consider at one of their January meetings, and kind of zero in on where we should start, what kind of dollar amount we'd be looking to spend each year, and what are the first properties that we ought to evaluate. And then we can open it up for a broader discussion, hopefully get your approval.
And then one other thing is that this won't replace what I think we've done very well in the past practice, our staff have done, is that when a property comes to be reviewed for either an addition or some change or whatever, all of the items are usually addressed at that point in time, and it brings that entire site plan back up to speed. This is just to get the ones that generally haven't had anything done or don't intend to do it, or have continually kind of ignored what's been going on. So there's just some practices that need to become more standard as part of our operation. So.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
If I may too, on a totally separate topic. Deputy Clerk Ritchie brought to my attention a deficiency, and I'm hoping that we can resolve it this evening with a simple motion. This is referring back to new business item 21-22. The final motion that was moved by Gearbaugh, seconded by Hart, was a motion to approve with conditions, one added by Mayor Pro Tem Gearbaugh. I believe it should be a motion to recommend approval to City Council, because ultimately a special land use is approved by City Council, not by the Planning Commission. Mr. Gearbaugh, would you be willing to, the substance of your motion wouldn't change, it would just be a motion to recommend approval to City Council, the application from Todd Gensheimer with conditions?
Yep.
Okay?
Yep, I'm good.
Very good.
Okay. So if we can vote on that, yeah.
If there's not any more discussion, all those in favor state by saying aye with the change.
Aye.
Those opposed? No. Thank you, Brian.
Yep, thank you.
All right, there is a motion to approve the absence of Mr. Carroll. It has been moved, Gearboss, seconded, Heft to excuse the absence of Mr. Carroll. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay, ayes have it. And there is a motion to adjourn at,
Mr. Chair, can I ask one question?
you sure
For
can.
those that may know, I don't know who does, but are we going to continue with any kind of virtual meeting option in the near future?
Got it.
I know the next meeting date, I'm going to be out of town, but I might be able to attend virtually.
Unfortunately, Mr. Beardsley, unless the, I believe it's essentially an emergency declaration is extended, it has been advised at the county level that the ability for folks to participate virtually and vote will expire at the end of this calendar
Okay,
year.
thank you.
So, again, unless something changes, and if it does, we will communicate that, but we will need to resume all in-person meetings beginning January 1, 2022.
Okay,
And I'll make a motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair,
Mr.
at
Chair.
8:16.
Second?
who seconded?
Second?
All right, it's been moved, Mayor Morrow, seconded, Bill to adjourn at 8:16. All those in favor state by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, ayes have it. Thank you very much.
Tom, you want to say something real quick?
No, that's okay. I was just going to, we can talk offline.
Sounds good.
Yep, thanks.